Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us again for week 3. This is the Reclamation Collective and Religious Trauma Institute. We've been meeting together to discuss various ways that COVID-19 may be triggering or bringing up various parts of religious trauma. So this week we're talking about intuition and answering kind of this question of, can I trust myself? So how to manage and how to navigate uncertainty and reclaim your intuition. So we're really excited that you all are joining us tonight, and make sure you're able to check out our last 2 recordings that we've done the prior weeks before, but we're just excited to have you here. We're going to go around and introduce ourselves, and I'll have everybody kind of say their name and go ahead and answer this question of, how was the concept of intuition addressed for you growing up? So I can start us off. I'm Kendra Snyder, and I am a licensed marriage and family therapist in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I'm one of the co-founders of Reclamation Collective. And I would say that the concept of intuition was really not at all addressed growing up for me. In fact, it was incredibly discouraged and downplayed. It was seen like any sort of trusting yourself or tapping into your own internal knowledge was actually seen as kind of a defiance against our trust in our belief of God. And intuition didn't exist apart from the Holy Spirit guiding us and kind of directing our thought process and our actions. So I would say that I did not even understand what intuition meant or really how it could look until I was in my late 20s when I met some friends who had a very different upbringing than I did, and really kind of saw how they tapped into their sense of self. So yeah, it was not addressed. It was actually downplayed and completely discouraged.
My name is Laura Anderson. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist also, and I have a private practice in Nashville, Tennessee. And I am one of the co-founders of the Religious Trauma Institute. And it's interesting to think about this question of how is intuition presented growing up? Because like you, Kendra, very similar, like it really wasn't. But I do know from a very young age, I had a strong sense of intuition, which later I labeled as like my gut feeling, which I really believe all of us have. But even as like a little kid, I would pick up on things that probably were far too old for me to pick up on. And I would get in trouble a lot for that, whether it was being accused of like listening in on conversations or making up lies or stories or those sorts of things. So when I got older, I tended more towards that gut feeling. But really, like you also said, Kendra, like that was attributed mostly to the Holy Spirit. And that was definitely an internal battle for me, because there was often times where I would have gut feelings and I knew if I listened, everything turned out okay. And if I went against it, there was usually the price to pay, not necessarily super negative, but just it wasn't always in my best interest. And so, so I've always kind of had that sense, but for quite a long period of my life, had to really say, oh, that's just the Holy Spirit inside of me. And then, after getting out of that environment, learned that, oh, that actually is my own inner voice, my intuition, and very trustworthy. And so that's been in development as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Laura. I also definitely identify with that piece about the Holy Spirit getting a lot of credit for my intuition as a child and an adolescent and a young adult. So my name is Kayla Felton. I am a licensed independent clinical social worker in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, and I also am one of the co-founders of the Reclamation Collective. And for me, in my religious context of origin, which was a fundamentalist background, and I was definitely taught that I was never introduced to the word intuition, to be honest. I don't think that wasn't even part of my vocabulary until probably my 20s. And I think part of that is because whenever anything was talked about of like a consciousness or like a sense of I should do something or I shouldn't do something, that was the Holy Spirit speaking to me. And so then whenever there was anything that's like, I have a feeling I should go talk to this person, or I have a sense that this person is experiencing this emotion, even if they haven't told me that, it was kind of like, well, that was the Holy Spirit giving you that insight. And it was never kind of like being able to give myself credit for being deeply intuitive and empathetic and caring. And yeah. But I think that this is probably the number one thing that I hear in our support groups and our retreats. It's probably the number one thing that I hear folks say that they are in the process of reclaiming is their intuition.
Yeah, wow, so much great content already. My name is Brian Pack, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker in Boise, Idaho, and I'm also a co-founder of the Religious Trauma Institute. Growing up, I just didn't trust my body because I was taught not to. I wasn't supposed to lean to my own understanding, but just defer to beliefs and doctrines and ideas. And so it felt almost like disconnected from my body. I was taught that my body was evil, that it was sinful. If I had an urge or a desire or a strong sense or a feeling, that was always met with a lot of skepticism and a lot of kind of pushing that away or almost having to kind of cut that off from my experience. And so, as a result, it felt like I was living in my head a lot. And I know we humans are really, we often live in our head. And so that's kind of a universal experience in some ways. And yet it felt like the religious upbringing that I had, it took it to a whole different level of just really not trusting myself. The other part of that for me was trusting other people. Now all of a sudden, if the thoughts, the beliefs, the ideas are the all important things to pay attention to, now I'm susceptible to another person's strong beliefs, ideas, doctrines, and I was taught to trust that instead of trusting myself. And so that kind of giving up my own sense of what's right for me, and even knowing what that was, I wasn't able to really develop that kind of awareness. And so this topic tonight is just super important and fascinating, and I'm just so glad that you all are joining us, and look forward to exploring this a bit more.
Thank you all. Brian, you bring up a really great point of, for a lot of us, in our faith of origin, we lost that or weren't encouraged to develop that kind of sense of self or self-trusting approach. And so we kind of exported that to our leaders or, people that were deemed kind of in charge or maybe wise or in leadership. And, especially with what's going on in the world right now, this feels like these two components of struggling to really trust our internal sense of what's good and safe for us, as well as determining how and what and who to trust externally, is definitely a theme that's coming up in a lot of conversations that I'm having with clients that I'm working with. And so I'm curious to hear from you all how you're seeing this particular piece of intuition show up with COVID-19 and kind of in the midst of all that's going on right now.
I think I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago in our discussion as I was deciding to at what point I needed to move my practice to my home and do it online. And even though I've really tried to tap into my tuition for many, many years and usually do it fairly well, I found myself coming to this place because there was so much chaos and uncertainty of like looking to other people to tell me what to do, and realized really quickly I couldn't at first recognize like why I was feeling so disrupted internally. Like I was physically ill because I'm, checking Twitter and I'm checking this news channel and my local news channel and all these sorts of things to figure out like, what am I supposed to do? Looking to other people to tell me this is how it has to be. And I do think that there is something very important about being able to have access to information that is accurate, and to be able to provide that to people to bring a sense of calm, which is what I'm trying to do with my clients. But I noticed that a lot of that idea of like, I just need somebody to tell me what to do. And I can't trust myself, that I don't know what's best. And when in reality, when I finally was like, no, this is the decision I know that I have to make that is best for myself, for my clients, for my practice, despite the fact that almost every other therapist in Nashville was not on board with it yet. I was like, this is what I have to do. And that feeling of just peace kind of settled back over me. But that's definitely been a struggle of like, who do I listen to? Who can I trust? Can I trust myself? Is that okay? Because that was a big thing in growing up in religion of you can't trust yourself. In fact, the only person that you can't trust is yourself. And you have to look to these external sources to tell you what is true and right and what are the next steps. So that's kind of been part of my process through this.
Laura, as you were talking, I was thinking of the difference between seeking input or seeking information versus seeking authority or answers. And I think for me too, I've noticed that struggle. And I just kind of, as you were talking, I was like, yeah, there's a difference between we want to be able to freely seek information and input from others so we can make really informed and useful decisions about our life. And that feels very different than seeking an answer or seeking authority, someone to tell us what to do. And I think for me, there's a quality of openness and curiosity. I do want to make the best decision. And of course, the example you gave is like, it's a really important one, right? It's people's health and well-being is on the line if with spreading this virus, if you maintain seeing people in person in your practice. And so to seek information is really important. And that feels like that's open and curious, and you can then decide what to do with that in a way that feels right to you. And that comes back to this internal sense of what's right for me based on the best available information. But I also found myself going like, okay, if the governor says I need to move my practice to my house, well, then I have to listen to the governor, right? And I was like, wow, like that's interesting. That reminded me so much. And back to Kendra's original question, like what am I seeing in my own self and in others around in this particular experience that we're all going through? And it is triggering that sense of, if someone can tell me what's right, then I'll feel safer, right? As opposed to it's up to me to research and figure things out the best I can, and then to make the best choice that I can with that information, as opposed to deferring to someone else's authority.
I think it's a little bit tricky in scenarios like COVID because it doesn't always feel like there's a ton of room for your intuition to wait on your intuition and feeling super in tune with what you believe to be true, what you know to be true before you have to act. So I think that there's another piece of this in terms of a crisis context. I think it's also hard when we already maybe don't always feel super in tune with our intuition, or haven't yet been able to really lean into trusting your gut. I think that crisis scenarios are going to really highlight that, because even more so than in many other contexts, you don't have a ton of time maybe to really sit with, well, how do I feel and what do I think about this, before we're having to literally alter major parts of our routine.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point, Laura, Kayla, that there's a collective trauma that's happening right now globally, and we're all experiencing it, differently and based on our own history. But one thing that I've noticed for myself is I'm having a little bit of trouble accessing kind of this core and this gut and this intuition with the same ease that I do when things are not as chaotic. Mm-hmm. And it really is highlighting this point, kind of what you were saying, Kayla, that when we're in a traumatized state, or when we're in a state of chaos or heightened anxiety, it's actually fairly significantly harder for us to tap into some of those grounded places. Not to mention when, for me, I've carried for 20 plus years of my life this inherent suppression and distrust of myself. So I've been trying to really challenge myself to just find moments of certainty, or more felt stability in really basic ways, So even as something as like, what feels like nourishing for me today to eat for breakfast or lunch, and just realizing that I'm gonna feel some of that disconnection from myself because I'm in a heightened state of arousal, and also realizing to going back to your point, Laura, that I really am wanting to lean back into this place of looking for a guidebook and looking for kind of A to Z response to this, the right way to do it, and as we all are well aware, there's just such a complex, oftentimes contradictory amounts of information that are going outside of us, and it's hard to kind of sort through that. And it's been important for me to kind of summarize what I just said. It's been important for me to really acknowledge that I'm in this heightened state. Accessing my intuition might be just a little bit harder than it normally has been for me.
As you were sharing, Kendra, I think I want to clarify at least how I'm using the term intuition. It's not in this dogmatic way, right? Where the beliefs and the ideas were like they're true, independent of the context and independent of the variables, and so I don't trust myself with this intuition in that dogmatic way. And as you were talking, Kendra, I was like, yeah, intuition is a way of checking in, noticing shifts and changes, trying something, pulling back, trying something else, noticing, and it's a very dynamic process. And I think sometimes for those of us who have come from a fundamentalist background, we can start to think about trusting our gut as like, well, if I feel it, then it's true or it's right. And I think there's a risk there as well. We want to approach this with as much information as we can get, and part of that is information from our own body, right? How are we reacting and responding? And part of that is, like you were mentioning, Kendra, what do I want to eat for breakfast? That's nurturing, and do I want to be physically active in some way that feels strong and supportive? And can I begin to shift and change those things in a way that trusting myself isn't a new form of dogma for me, but it's a new language. It's a new way, a new process, a new way of understanding. And so I'm really, really glad you brought that up. That really is an insightful way of thinking about that.
When we are in that traumatized space, like we are in survival mode. So, things like being able to critically think or tap into our intuition are not as accessible to us. And I think that's why, even for people that were growing up in fundamentalist contexts, as we're coming out of that, we're starting to see like, oh, I was kind of like always in this space of maybe freeze, collapse, or fawning, especially. And to go, that's potentially what allowed us to be maybe even more susceptible to some of these very certain messages that were coming from the top people of going, this is what you have to do, because that compared to like our safety. So if I do these things, then I will be safe. And so I've noticed too, like how that translates then in these times when it's like, well, I'm not in that context anymore, but we have maybe political leaders that are feeding us misinformation or partial truths or complete untruths. And because there is this collective trauma that's happening, we are more susceptible to go, well, I mean, maybe that is the right thing. It doesn't maybe sound right or it doesn't feel right, but I don't know if I can trust myself in this time. And this is an authority that's telling me this thing. So maybe I do just have to listen. And if we've been conditioned to kind of already, think and believe that way, it would be very easy to become very susceptible to that again.
Kind of the way I think of intuition is like, am I in tune with my body? And so a lot of times it's like my body saying like, I don't feel comfortable with this, or I don't feel like I have enough information to feel safe in this context or with this person, or accepting this is just like an absolute truth. So I think sometimes intuition for me is that experience of like, something doesn't feel right here. What is it? And then taking the time to like assess, is it because something is not right here? Or is it because of another external factor that is just uncomfortable? Or is it that I don't trust it? And being able to distinguish more that like, if something doesn't feel right, it might actually be because it isn't right. And so I think there's a lot of safety too, that like sometimes our bodies are communicating to us that they're not safe. But for many years, some folks have been kind of had that sensation be really invalidated and saying, well, you are safe here because this is the community. You are safe here. And I think it's especially a violation for folks who then have had experiences that were not safe. And I also, this is kind of me more speaking to just kind of how I think intuition is really targeted by, I would say specifically by spiritual abuse. I think that a lot of folks who've experienced any form of spiritual abuse are going to have a real potential disconnect with their intuition. And that's in part because I think this means of gaslighting is often used by spiritual abusers, folks that are going to try to put in this idea that you're crazy and validate your intuition and validate your sense of safety or your lack of sense of safety. If you were to advocate for yourself and say something doesn't feel right, that it's going to be because you don't have enough faith or because you're dumb or because you're being aggressive. I think particularly women that I've worked with and heard a lot of narratives around experiencing spiritual abuse from a masculine person towards a feminine person. I think there is a lot of that sensation around should you advocate for yourself or should you name that there's an unhealthy dynamic here, that your intuition is telling you you're not safe, this isn't okay. That can get turned on back onto you that, well, you ruined this person's life by coming forward, or you are being aggressive and you're being, predatory by trying to harm this other person simply by trying to bring to light harm that already has been done. So that's kind of taking it on a little different of a tangent, but that's where I think like this concept of intuition comes up for me all the time in the work that we do. And I think folks who also have experienced that indoctrination and messaging around like you are inherently evil and wicked. I don't exactly recall there was a Bible verse that I know I had hidden in my heart once upon a time. It's clearly not still there, but there is some verse that's coming to my mind about like being inherently wicked. Like the heart is deceitful. And just kind of like that is literally messaging saying as a child, I received that message that like you cannot trust your heart, you cannot trust your emotions. Those are invalid unless they are directly given to you by the Bible, by Jesus, the Holy Spirit. So that's a little bit anecdotal from my experience, the messaging that I received. And I do think that for many folks who have experienced adverse religious experiences in a context where they were told that they could not trust themselves, quite literally, word for word, were taught that is part of why this is such a heavy topic for folks to later in life, through deconstruction and reclamation, to find a space to reclaim their intuition.
Yeah, just to add on really quickly to your definition of gaslighting, because I think it's so important, that idea of like, you're saying like, you're crazy or whatever. And also adding on like, no, it didn't really happen like that. I've heard that a lot with COVID. I think about certain political leaders that back in several months ago saying, this isn't real. This isn't really going to happen. It's not that bad. We can defeat this, which is also spiritual bypassing. That's a totally different topic. But that idea of like trying to tell you like that didn't actually happen, which we see in spiritual contexts, as well as now with this of like, yeah, that fake news, like that didn't really happen. And that's an important piece, I think, as we're talking about intuition, that gaslighting, adding onto that gaslighting definition of really starting to cut you to your core.
I want to also add on a little the distinction between feeling safe versus feeling like you can survive. And so I think sometimes there's this faux sense of safety or this artificial sense of safety. If you comply, if you please and appease, if you fawn, if you do what's required, then you get to live another day. The group allows you to still exist within the group. And that can feel like safe, right? But it's very different than actually feeling safe. And that's a feeling like I can survive. But it's this kind of survival in this kind of more of a powerless place, right? I'm just going to go along with what the person is telling me, as opposed to I'm going to do what's right for me. I'm going to do the thing that matters to me. And that safety often is a result of a very powerful activated response to a threat. And when as you're mentioning too, Kayla, a lot of folks within a religious context don't have access to aggression because if they express anger or aggression, then they're dismissed or they're pushed down. And so then it becomes unsafe to do the very thing that would give you a sense of safety. And so you can get a sense of, I'm allowed to exist, but I have to be quiet, I have to be small, I have to be powerless. And that's that kind of survival physiology that often we mistake for feeling safe. And I know there's some semantics here, and the words are similar in a lot of ways, that feeling like I can survive versus feeling safe. And from a trauma perspective, I think it's important to point out that what we mistake as being safe often is just that I can survive. And it doesn't feel powerful, it doesn't feel open and connected. It feels very much like I just have to go along. And I just wanted to
so good. Yeah.
That was really, really well said. And I think the three of you really highlight, I think, a big question that would be helpful for our listeners, just to have you each kind of share a little bit personally, if you feel comfortable, or in your work with people. Just, after many, many years of being asked, or in order to survive, really tamping down that intuition and that sense of what is safest and what's good for me. I'm wondering if you each can speak to how you have learned or how you've helped people tap into this trusting of yourself after years of maybe not having that sort of relationship with yourself.
I think for me, a lot of this is where I started that, like, what we might refer to as like inner child work, or kind of like talking to your inner child. I think for me, I've been able to give my childhood self so much credit now. I'm trying to give my childhood self the positive reinforcement that she deserved, because she was super intuitive. And I can recall, as I process some of my adverse religious experiences, I can recall having that sensation of, this does not feel right. This does not feel equitable or equal or fair, or even respectful. And I'm thinking kind of specifically to moments where I maybe have engaged in different forms of evangelization, including colonization, which I think that those can be very hand in hand in different contexts. And I think that for me, growing up, I often had that sensation of, this doesn't feel right. Something does not feel right about this relationship, about this interaction, or about this dynamic that's happening in this group. And I think that I've been able to get so much more in tune with my body and my intuition by basically promising her, I'm going to listen to you. I'm not necessarily going to do whatever, stop everything that I don't feel good about. There's still many unpleasant experiences that I'm going to need to engage with, but I'm at least going to take the time to slow down and ask the question of is my body aware of something that my consciousness is not yet aware of? Because sometimes I think my nervous system is kind of in tune with things in my environment that my consciousness intellectually has not yet processed or absorbed.
I think for me, I feel like I have a million ideas of like, how do we start developing that? We've thrown around the word certainty. Last week we talked about it a little bit. And this week too, and I know we've kind of said, oh, certainty feels really almost fundamental, right? Certain or uncertain. So there's that dualistic thinking. And for me, it's about stability over certainty, because that allows room for growth and fluidity and safety, ultimately. And that to me feels really important. But even as you were talking, Kayla, what came to mind for me is sometimes I use the word intuition and trust or self-trust like interchangeably. So how do I develop my sense of intuition also goes hand in hand with like, how do I trust myself? And honestly, what came to mind is, I don't know if you'll have watched or read Brene Brown's Anatomy of Trust, where she breaks down like, what is trust? Because when we say like, I don't trust myself or I don't trust this other person, that's such a big elusive statement. And she gives this acronym of BRAVING, BRAVING, which stands for boundaries, reliability, accountability, vault, integrity, non-judgmentalism, and giving the most generous assumption. And there's way more that goes into that. So look up her talk on the Oprah Network. But she talks very clearly like that. Not only does that come into play in relationships, but you have to have that in yourself first. You have to be able to develop self-trust to know what that feels like in order to be able to trust other people and to know, do I feel safe with this person? I'll just use like the R, reliability. So ways that I can develop my intuition and self-trust is like, can I count on myself? Can I do the things that I say that I'm going to do? Can I show up for myself? Can I, like follow through in going to this place or having this conversation? Can I follow through in listening to my body when she's erupting and, it would maybe be socially awkward to like leave somewhere, but that's actually what she's looking for is, and being reliable that I'm going to do what I say that I'm going to do, if that's listening to my body. So that's kind of what came up for me in terms of like developing that. And then again, like looking for those ways to find stability. And that could be in a routine. It could be in the smoothie I have for breakfast every morning. That feels stable. I can rely on that. Or even simply just like, what do I want right now? Like, can I tap into what that is? I don't want my smoothie. I actually want French toast. And that sounds so simple, but can I trust that this is just what my body wants right now and be okay with that? And tomorrow it might be a smoothie, but today it's this. And so what are those ways that I can tap in just in the little, very like non-threatening, non-crisis, what is seemingly mundane moments? And can I trust, tap in and trust so that in those bigger moments, I'm already used to connecting to myself?
For me to answer that question, I learned a new language. I learned the language of sensation. My body's been saying things to me, been shouting to me at times, and been, there's just sharing really important information. And I wasn't able to hear it because I wasn't listening with sensation. I wasn't being able to notice, when I get that kind of tightness in my gut, when I feel this kind of tension, when I feel this kind of like bracing, like I don't feel quite safe here. And before, it would be easy just to kind of override that or to not pay attention to that. When I began to learn the language of sensation, what my body is saying, what that means to me, and then, like you were saying, Laura, we can't really trust ourselves until we have the experience of being there for ourselves or having that experience of doing what was necessary to defend or protect ourselves. And so, the awareness, the being able to notice how my body's feeling, and then to do difficult things or maybe initially risky or scary things, and to notice that I'm okay, that I can survive that I can have that experience and be okay. And sometimes that is maybe not responding or not doing something, and notice, can I be okay in that state as well? When I only approached myself kind of in my head with my thoughts and beliefs, I wasn't able to notice that really important information. I wasn't able, that data wasn't available to me. And so I think for me, just awareness is so central to my own journey and with clients that I work with. Just noticing. And it's interesting when I see clients in my office, which I'm not doing now, but even online, the first minute or so of the session, we just spend some time noticing, and whether that's scanning the room where you're at, whether that's just noticing how your body's feeling in the moment, doing a brief body scan, noticing what you're bringing with you to this conversation. Does it feel safe and okay? What kind of cues am I getting from my nervous system in that moment? And so for me, intuition is tapping into all this information that was already there. It's almost coming home to my body, coming home to this part of me that was always there, and we weren't able to communicate before because don't trust your body, don't trust your intuition, just live in this kind of disembodied place of thoughts and beliefs and ideas, where I'm way more susceptible to other folks when we're competing with ideas and beliefs, as opposed to, does this feel right for me? And how do I know it's not right for me? Well, these are the ways my body's communicating to me that this isn't right, and being able to trust that. It's not something that you just can decide to trust. You have to have the experience to be able to trust that. And so I think for me, that awareness, and then being able to, if I can notice what my body's telling me, then I can you begin to say things to my body as well, and so maybe it's just kind of holding myself and noticing that things are feeling kind of out of control, and so kind of coming in and embracing myself can be a way of coming back to the experience of being safe and okay. They might be pushing away, like this isn't okay for me, and so to have this experience of pushing away. I know, Laura, you mentioned, rage walking a few weeks ago, and in noticing, I don't feel safe here. I need to do something to escape. My body needs to know that I'm capable of escaping, and walking or running or doing something physical. And even if you're not able to physically move in that way, to have the felt sense experience of that. And often I've run while sitting in a chair, had the experience of running, and I feel that power in my arms, my legs, and notice that movement, that's part of that. And so I just want to be clear that we can't always do the thing that our body's telling us we need to do in that moment, but we can approximate that in a way that does still communicate to my nervous system that I'm powerful, strong, independent, able to do what's necessary. So that's been part of my own personal journey. And as I've shared that with clients working through trauma, coming into your body, coming home to your body, being able to communicate in a way that we can hear and understand and use that information has been so important.
I really relate to what you were saying just a second ago, Brian, of developing a new language with yourself that was based on senses and your body's sensations that it's giving you. And I would say that that's been one of the most significant ways that I've learned how to trust myself, is actually building an understanding of what feels safe and good, and what doesn't feel safe and what doesn't feel good inside my body. After spending so many years letting someone else's idea of safety or goodness direct my own understanding, I had to get right down to like the basics of, what does a yes feel like in Kendra's body? What does good feel like in Kendra's body? Can I locate it? Like, does it live in my belly? Does it live in my chest? Does it live in my throat? And really pairing feelings and my yes and my no with specific parts of my body, specific sensations, as developing that new language, or creating a language that's built on the self and built on that information that our body gives us a lot of the time. And another piece that's been really helpful for me, that my own therapist has really encouraged me to do, is when we have space to to not necessarily make a decision until we get that yes or until we get that no from our body. You really viewing it as like, I haven't gotten my answer yet. And obviously there's times where we don't have the luxury to wait for our yes or our no. And we do have to kind of make a decision quicker than we maybe want to. But in those moments where we can create as much space to really determine, what is my gut saying? Can I get my yes? Can I get my no? And then acting out of that has been very helpful for me as far as really rebuilding that sense of internal trust and stability within myself. Thank you all so much. This has been very, very encouraging, and I've learned a lot from the three of you. And as we wrap up, I'm curious, do you, Brian, Kayla, or Laura, have anything else you'd like to say as we wrap up, just briefly?
A positive spin on this concept of our body keeping the score of trauma. I think there's also, like, our body keeps the score, and it may remember things that we maybe cognitively don't remember. And because of that, our body's also, like, always doing the work of trying to protect us. And so I think that on the positive note is that if your body has stored that trauma, then your intuition probably has access to kind of giving you some warning signs that you may not be, even if you haven't cognitively, emotionally worked through that trauma, you may not even yet be conscious that it exists and that it's stored somewhere in your body. Your intuition might be how your body chooses to reveal that to you, is by letting you know you don't feel safe. And when you ask yourself, why don't I feel safe here? When all of the external stimuli would imply that I'm fine, then be able to ask yourself, like, well, what is my intuition communicating to me? Have I not always felt safe in this situation or this context? Is there some type of trigger that's here that I'm not even conscious of, but my body is very conscious of the existence of this trigger?
I guess I would just say, do the work of befriending your body, noticing the sensations, and be curious and open too. I think sometimes it can feel overwhelming. Learning a new language is intimidating. That's why most of us speak one language, right? And in this language, we have this kind of innate sense of it, and so, like, the building blocks are already there. It takes a bit of intention, a bit of awareness, but it's certainly worth doing. And it won't solve everything. It won't make everything better, but it will definitely give you a lot more tools to work with. And being able to trust that intuition can be the difference between something horrific happening and it being traumatizing, or being able to respond in a way that your body needs in order to be safe and okay in that moment. So yeah, it's definitely worth doing. So I would encourage folks to really spend the time to do that.
Yeah, I echo that. As you were talking, I was like, have this almost like overwhelming emotional experience of, like, the language of sensation in our body, and thinking about how so many of us in fundamentalist contexts were disembodied and made to believe that our bodies were evil and certainly not wise and not to be trusted. And I just think about, like, I spent so many years in my own healing journey trying to access my body, but not really sure how to do it, and had kind of a nervous breakdown moment a few years back, and finally got in touch with my body. And I think it was that she felt safe finally. She was ready to melt. I said I was frozen for many, many years, and she was ready to melt. And, like, that shifted everything. Like, I mean, I've been reading through my journals for my dissertation because that's part of my data. And so to go back even 5 years and read who I was in 2015 versus who I was at the end of 2019 has brought me so many tears of, like, just joy. And so to your point, Brian, what a gift we have in our bodies. To be able to tap into that wisdom, it changes everything.
I know we're wrapping up. I just want to acknowledge Laura, as you were feeling the experience of how important this is, and just to also join you in that. And I'm definitely, it's made all the difference in my own life. It's so important. It's so important. I can't even underline that enough, like how important this work is, and why it's important to find a good trauma therapist, someone who understands the nervous system, the body, because if we're just trying to convince ourselves with logic and reason and cognitively work through these things, we're missing out on so much. And so thank you so much for sharing. And what an amazing conversation. I'm just really glad that we're talking about this topic.
I echo everything that the three of you just said, and it really is such a beautiful journey to turn inward, become friends with ourselves, learn the language of our body, and see it as a powerful, powerful source of knowledge and just beauty. So thank you to the three of you for your insight and wisdom, and thank you all for joining us for this discussion tonight. Please join us next week on April 26th. We'll be diving into the question of, will I ever feel safe again? And we're really going to be looking at specific ways of supporting your nervous system and finding internal safety amidst this anxious time and time of uncertainty. So thank you all again, and we look forward to seeing you next week. See ya.
Yeah.
Bye.